There are moments in life when hope feels lost, when the weight of sorrow is so heavy that no comfort seems enough. Yet it is in these very moments that the power of God shines brightest. The story of Lazarus is not just about a man being raised from the dead. It is about faith in the middle of despair, love in the face of loss, and the glory of God revealed when all seems over. In the quiet village of Bethany, just a short distance from Jerusalem, lived three siblings who were close friends of Jesus: Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus. Their home was a place where Jesus often found rest, laughter, and the warmth of true friendship. But one day the atmosphere of their house changed. Lazarus grew sick, his health declined quickly, and his sisters watched with growing fear. They had seen Jesus heal the blind, restore the lame, and open the ears of the deaf. They believed with all their hearts that he could heal Lazarus too. Martha and Mary sent an urgent message to Jesus. The message was simple, heartfelt, and filled with desperation. "Lord, the one you love is sick." They did not ask him to rush to Bethany or demand a miracle. They simply told him the truth, trusting that his love for their brother would move him to act. Every passing hour felt like a heavy stone pressing on their hearts. Each time Lazarus coughed or grew weaker, the sisters' eyes turned to the door, hoping to see Jesus enter. When the message reached Jesus, the disciples waited to see his reaction. But Jesus said something strange, something that seemed almost confusing. "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Instead of rushing to Bethany, instead of leaving immediately to heal his friend, Jesus stayed where he was for 2 more days. To the disciples, this delay was puzzling. To Mary and Martha, it must have felt like silence, like abandonment in the moment they needed him most. But Jesus saw beyond the sickness, beyond the fear, beyond the grave. He knew the end of the story even before it began. What looked like a delay was actually preparation for something greater, something that would strengthen the faith of his followers and reveal the glory of God in a way they had never imagined. Back in Bethany, the hours turned into days. Lazarus' breathing grew shallow, his strength slipped away, and finally he died. Grief filled the house, and mourners from the village came to comfort the sisters. Their hearts were broken. They had sent for Jesus, but he had not come. The silence of his absence spoke louder than their cries. Yet even in that silence, God's plan was unfolding. Time did not wait. In Bethany, every hour carried more weight than the last. The sound of Lazarus struggling to breathe filled the quiet house, while Martha moved quickly to care for him, and Mary sat at his side, whispering prayers through her tears. Their eyes kept turning to the road, watching for the figure they longed to see: Jesus. Every shadow, every voice outside the door made their hearts leap for a moment. But no familiar face appeared. The silence stretched long, and with it came the pain of waiting. But far from Bethany, when the message had reached him, Jesus had looked at his disciples and spoken words they could not understand. "This sickness will not end in death. It is for God's glory." Then he did something that no one expected. He stayed. He did not rush to Bethany. He did not send a word of comfort. He waited for 2 whole days, while his friend grew weaker, while hope in that little village seemed to crumble. The disciples whispered among themselves. They had seen Jesus heal strangers, touch lepers, and restore life to people who had no one to speak for them. Now this was Lazarus, his close friend, a man he loved. Why would he not go? The silence of his decision pressed on them like a mystery they dared not question. And yet beneath their confusion was a quiet trust. They had walked with him long enough to know that every word he spoke carried purpose, even when they could not see it. Finally, after those 2 days had passed, Jesus turned to his disciples and said, "Let us go back to Judea." The disciples froze. Bethany was close to Jerusalem, and they remembered too well the anger of the leaders there. They remembered stones being picked up, threats being whispered, danger waiting around every corner. "Rabbi," they said with alarm, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back?" But Jesus, calm and steady, answered with a strange picture. "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." His words pointed to something greater than safety. He was walking in the light of his Father's will, and nothing, not threats, not stones, not even death, could turn him away from it. Then, as if to shake the dust of confusion from their hearts, he told them plainly, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." The disciples, still caught in the simplicity of his words, thought he meant natural sleep. If he sleeps, they reasoned, then he will get better. But Jesus' eyes told a deeper truth. "Lazarus is dead," he said at last. The weight of those words silenced the group. And then another mystery, another twist of his voice. "For your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." In that moment, Thomas, often remembered for his doubts, showed courage. With a steady voice, he said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." His words carried the shadow of danger and the light of loyalty. They did not understand what was waiting in Bethany, but they chose to walk beside him. So the journey began. The road back toward Judea stretched out before them. Behind them lay the comfort of safety. But ahead was a village wrapped in grief, sisters lost in sorrow, and a grave sealed with stone. Jesus walked with steady steps, not rushing, not fearful, carrying in his heart the power of life itself. The road to Bethany was not just a path of dust and stone. It was a road of choice, of risk, of faith. Each step carried the weight of danger, but also the promise of something far greater. Jesus walked ahead, calm and steady, while the disciples followed, their hearts tangled between fear and loyalty. They remembered the angry faces of the leaders in Jerusalem, the stones lifted in violence, the whispers of plots against him. Now they were returning to that same region, not to avoid death but to walk straight into its shadow. Thomas, whose voice had broken the silence earlier, still carried his words like a torch in the dark. "Let us also go, that we may die with him." The other disciples looked at him, some with doubt, some with quiet respect. But all of them knew the truth. To follow Jesus was not safe. It never had been. Yet there was something about his presence, about the certainty in his eyes, that drew them forward even when their courage faltered. The landscape stretched wide under the sun. The desert winds pressed against them, carrying the dryness of the wilderness, but also the faint scent of olive trees near the village they approached. The closer they came, the heavier the air seemed to grow. It was not just the journey of miles. It was the journey toward grief, toward a house filled with tears, toward a tomb sealed in silence. Along the way, Jesus spoke of light and darkness, of walking in the day and stumbling in the night. The disciples tried to hold on to his words, but they could not yet see what he meant. To them, the trip was about safety and danger, life and death. To Jesus, it was about glory breaking into despair, about faith awakening in the midst of loss. When they reached the edge of Bethany, word spread quickly. "Jesus is coming," the people whispered. Some hurried ahead, their voices carrying into the village. Inside the house where Martha and Mary mourned, the whispers became hope and heartbreak tangled together. Martha could not wait. With her heart pounding, she rose and ran out to meet him before he entered the village. The dust clung to her clothes. Her tears mixed with the wind, but her voice carried the sharp edge of both grief and faith. "Lord," she said when she reached him, her voice trembling, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Her words were not accusation, but sorrow, filled with the ache of what might have been. Yet even in her grief, she held onto a fragile thread of belief. "But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus looked at her with a gaze that saw deeper than death, deeper than despair. "Your brother will rise again," he told her. Martha nodded, clinging to the hope of the resurrection at the end of time, the distant promise taught by her faith. But Jesus was not speaking of distant hope. His words carried the weight of eternity stepping into the present. "I am the resurrection and the life," he said, his voice steady and filled with authority. "The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Martha's tears shone in the sunlight, her voice soft but certain. Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. In that moment, the journey was no longer about distance or danger. It was about faith standing face to face with the Savior, about sorrow colliding with the promise of life. And as Martha turned to call her sister Mary, the road that began with fear and silence now opened into the greatest revelation Bethany would ever witness. The house in Bethany was heavy with sorrow. The air itself seemed to hold the sound of weeping, rising and falling like waves. Neighbors had gathered, voices hushed, their presence a quiet attempt to comfort two grieving sisters. Inside, shadows stretched across the walls, and the silence between sobs carried more weight than words. Death had settled here. It was not just the absence of Lazarus, but the ache of unanswered prayers, the sting of waiting for a friend who had not arrived in time. When Martha whispered to Mary, "The teacher is here, and he is asking for you," Mary rose quickly. Those who sat with her thought she was going to the tomb to weep there, so they followed. But Mary's steps were not toward the tomb. They carried her through the village paths until she reached Jesus. Her tears blurred her vision, and when she saw him, she fell at his feet. Her voice broke, carrying the raw edge of grief. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." There was no pretense in her words, no careful tone, only sorrow, honest and deep. Around her the mourners wept loudly. Their cries filled the air, and the sound wrapped itself around Jesus. The moment was not distant to him. He felt their grief as if it were his own. The Gospel tells us he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. The weight of human sorrow pressed against him, and for a moment the eternal Son of God stood in silence, his heart breaking with theirs. Then came the shortest verse in Scripture, but one that holds the depth of his compassion. Jesus wept. His tears fell, not from weakness, but from love. The Creator of life, who would soon call Lazarus out of death, allowed himself to stand fully in the grief of the moment. He did not rush past their pain to show his power. He entered it, felt it, and shared it. His tears told Mary and Martha and everyone watching that God does not stand far away when we mourn. He draws near. Some of the people whispered, "See how he loved him." Others questioned, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Their words hung in the air, questions that echoed what Martha and Mary had already spoken. Yet in the midst of doubt, in the midst of tears, Jesus remained. He did not defend himself. He did not explain away their pain. Instead, he stood among them, his tears mingling with theirs, his silence deeper than their questions. The crowd shifted, following as Jesus asked to be taken to the place where Lazarus had been laid. Together they moved through the narrow streets, past olive trees and stone walls, until they reached the tomb. It was a cave, dark and sealed with a heavy stone. The mourners gathered there, their voices softer now, as if the nearness of the grave demanded silence. Mary stood beside Martha, her face streaked with tears, her heart torn between sorrow and the faintest spark of hope. The moment had reached its deepest valley. Death was not just an idea now. It was there, 4 days sealed behind stone. The cries of the mourners, the questions of the crowd, the tears of Jesus, all of it gathered at the mouth of the tomb. The story had descended into the darkest silence, the place where human hope ends, and it was here, in this silence, that the voice of life was about to speak. The path ended at a cave carved into the hillside. Its mouth was shut by a large stone, heavy and unmoving, a silent barrier between the living and the dead. The crowd stopped, the murmurs fading into uneasy silence. All eyes turned toward Jesus, waiting, wondering. He stood before the tomb not as a stranger to grief, but as one who had walked into its very heart. His face, still wet with tears, now carried a different weight. Not only sorrow, but authority. Then his voice broke the silence. "Take away the stone." The words fell like a challenge, stirring shock among the mourners. A wave of whispers rippled through the crowd. Some gasped. Others shook their heads. To open the tomb was to face the finality of death. It was to see what no one wanted to see. And then Martha stepped forward. Her face was pale, her voice low but urgent. "Lord, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Her words carried the rawness of reality. The stone was not just a barrier of rock, it was the barrier of impossibility. 4 days in the grave meant hope was gone. The story was closed, the final chapter written. To move the stone was to open the wound again, to expose what could never be healed. But Jesus turned to her, his gaze steady, his voice gentle but firm. "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" His words cut through the weight of doubt, calling Martha and everyone present to look beyond the grave, beyond the odor of death, to the power of the one who stood before them. The men moved hesitantly toward the stone, their hands pressed against its rough surface. With straining muscles and trembling hearts, they began to push. The grinding sound of rock against earth filled the air as the stone shifted slowly, inch by inch, until the dark mouth of the tomb stood open. The crowd held its breath. The smell of death drifted out, and people covered their faces. The moment was raw, unbearable, yet no one turned away. Jesus lifted his eyes, not to the crowd, not to the sisters, but to the heavens above. His voice rose in prayer. "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." The words hung in the air, a bridge between heaven and earth, spoken so that the doubting hearts around him would know the source of what was about to happen. Silence fell again. The stone was gone, the tomb lay open, and all that remained was waiting. The crowd leaned forward, their eyes fixed on Jesus, their ears straining to hear his next word. Martha and Mary clung to each other, torn between fear and desperate hope. The moment was thick, like the stillness before a storm, like the breath held before a miracle breaks through. And then, with a voice that carried through the valley, a voice strong enough to shatter the silence of death, Jesus cried out, "Lazarus, come out!" The air stood still after the command. The words of Jesus, "Lazarus, come out," seemed to echo against the stone walls of the tomb and roll across the gathered crowd. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The silence was deep, so deep that the sound of wind in the olive trees and the faint rustle of clothes could be heard. Dozens of eyes strained toward the dark opening of the cave, waiting, doubting, hoping, afraid. And then, from within the shadows, came the sound. The faint scrape of movement, the shuffle of feet against stone. Gasps rippled through the crowd, hands lifted to mouths, eyes wide in disbelief. The darkness at the mouth of the tomb shifted, and slowly a figure appeared. Wrapped in strips of burial cloth from head to foot, the silhouette of a man staggered forward, bound yet moving, dead yet alive. The cry of astonishment broke through the stillness. Some shrieked in fear, others fell to their knees. Mothers pulled children close, men covered their faces, unable to take their eyes away. Lazarus, who had lain in silence for 4 long days, stepped into the light of the sun once more. His face was still bound with cloth, his arms and legs tied, but his chest rose and fell with breath. The impossible stood before them, undeniable and real. Mary pressed her hands to her lips, tears pouring down her cheeks. Martha's body shook as relief and awe collided in her soul. The sisters moved forward, half in shock, half in joy, unable to comprehend what their eyes were seeing. Their brother was alive. The grief that had crushed them, the silence that had haunted them, was shattered in a single moment. Jesus, standing steady before the crowd, spoke again, this time with gentleness. "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." The words were both command and gift. Men rushed forward, trembling as they reached out to unwrap the strips of linen. Each layer peeled away revealed life, warmth, color in his skin, where death had once claimed him. The smell of decay was gone, replaced by the living breath of a man returned. The people around them wept openly, some with joy, others with fear. Some could only whisper, "God has done this." Others shouted praises, lifting their hands to the sky. Still others stood frozen, torn between belief and denial. But none could deny what they had witnessed. Death had been silenced. The grave had been broken. Life had returned where no life should be. Lazarus blinked against the sunlight, his eyes adjusting, his breath unsteady, his voice still silent. Yet he stood, alive, free from the grip of death. His sisters embraced him. Their cries of sorrow now turned to cries of joy. The crowd pressed closer, overwhelmed by the sight, their voices colliding in a storm of awe. And in the center of it all stood Jesus, calm and steady, his eyes filled not only with love for his friend, but with a deeper truth. This miracle was not only for Lazarus, it was for every soul standing there, for every heart that would one day face the silence of the grave. It was a sign, a glimpse of the power that would soon rise from his own tomb. The miracle of Bethany was not just the return of a man from death. It was the revelation that the voice of Jesus carries authority no tomb can resist, no grave can hold back. Death listens when he speaks, and when he calls, life answers. The miracle at Bethany did more than bring Lazarus back to life. It shook the very ground of belief. For those who stood near the tomb, it was not just a moment of wonder. It was the moment when heaven touched earth in full power. They had seen sickness healed before. They had seen demons flee. But this was different. Death itself, the final enemy, had been forced to release its grip. The whispers of the crowd became shouts, and the shouts spread into the village, then beyond Bethany. Word traveled like fire across the land. Lazarus lives. Some fell on their knees in worship, convinced that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God. Others ran to the leaders, filled with fear of what this power meant. The miracle divided hearts, but it could not be erased. Life stood where death had reigned, and no argument could silence that truth. For Mary and Martha, the return of their brother was more than answered prayer. It was the proof that love and power dwell together in Jesus. He had not abandoned them, even when it seemed he had delayed. His timing, though painful, had unveiled a glory far greater than they imagined. Their tears were not wasted. Their waiting was not in vain. Their grief became the stage where God's power was revealed. Yet the miracle was not only for them. It was a sign for every soul who would one day face loss, for every person who would stand at the edge of a grave with breaking heart. The story of Lazarus speaks across time, whispering that death does not have the final word. The same voice that called Lazarus from the tomb still calls today, offering life, hope, and the promise of resurrection. But there was also something deeper hidden in this miracle, something the crowd could not yet see. When Jesus spoke into the tomb of Lazarus, he was pointing toward his own. Soon, he too would be laid in the earth. Soon, a stone would seal his body in darkness. Yet just as he had called his friend out of death, he himself would rise, breaking the grave forever. The raising of Lazarus was not the end. It was the foreshadow, the glimpse, the sign of a greater victory still to come. And so the story ends where it truly begins, with faith. Faith that believes even when the stone is heavy, even when the silence lingers, even when hope seems buried. Faith that hears the voice of Jesus and trusts that no grave is too strong, no night too dark, no sorrow too deep for him to overcome. The tomb in Bethany stands as a reminder. The one who wept also conquers. The one who delayed also delivered. The one who called Lazarus by name still calls to us today. His words remain, echoing through every valley of despair, every shadow of death. I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And in those words lies the heart of the story, that life is stronger than death, that love is greater than sorrow, and that the glory of God shines brightest when all seems lost.